Hey there, everybody. I'm over here with a friend. We're playtesting the Task Force X game, but I've got a little bit of a break, and I thought I would show you this awesome bit from an inverse interview that Zack Snyder did with Frank Miller. There's a lot of great nuggets, and this is just going to cut out a vertical slice of that where they talk about Greek mythology, how Adam West inspired The Dark Knight Returns, and the political opinions they have on the characters within that setting and kind of which one is happier in their setup. So I'll read it along and I'll have a link to the full interview down below because it is really fascinating stuff. Mythology, both ancient and modern, plays a significant role in your work. How do you see classic archetypes? Have they influenced your characters and the worlds you've created at all? Frank Miller. Well, we're definitely kindred spirits here, Zach, because I grew up on that stuff, and it's at the absolute hardcore of the superhero comics that I grew up on and was first trained to do. If you look at the slogan for Shazam, it's basically just a list of mythic heroes and gods. It's Solomon, it's Hercules, that's the S and the H, and it's Atlas, Zeus, and I don't remember what the last two are. And Superman has the origin of Moses, which kind of makes sense since he was created by a couple of Jewish kids in Ohio. And never mind Wonder Woman, she's just got Greek mythology all over her. Yeah, legit. So how do I put it? If comics are kind of like the bastard child of other media, they're also the same to mythology. I have this theory that in the modern world we lost myth, and so we use comics and superheroes to kind of decode the problems of our time. That is to say, in the ancient world, if a volcano went off, you'd be like, oh, there's a god in that mountain and he's mad. Now, if a terrorist flies a plane into the World Trade Center, it's harder to make a myth out of it, but comics might allow that sort of thinking. I don't know how you feel about that. Well, I believe the birth of religion and mythology was basically a cave dweller not understanding lightning and having to anthropomorphize nature. Religion was the precursor to science. Along the way were all these gods and heroes were created. The Greeks just couldn't stop puking them out. They had a legion of superheroes going on their own, and those really stayed in people's heads. And these superhero universes essentially are the wild amalgam of sort of recreated Greek, Nordic, and Hebrew mythologies. Yeah, they've really endured. And so is your feeling that to talk about mythology and comics is really kind of 101? Because we're all still living in the shadow of those gods. So maybe that's what it is. If you deconstruct, you kind of peel away, and by peeling away, you really get to the mythological part of it. That's the best way to put it. I've always found deconstruct to be a problematic term because people usually assume that when you deconstruct something, you're tearing it to pieces. And that's only half of what deconstruction really is, because it's tearing its essence and then rebuilding it stronger than it ever was before. I mean, I wrote Batman cynically in order to mock the character. I basically was just looking to get rid of all this shit and restore him to a kind of stature he had in my mind when I was 7 years old. The Dark Knight Returns is often credited with revolutionizing how Batman is perceived. But also my takeaway from Dark Knight Returns is exactly the same as you just stated it. Some people would say it's deconstruction, and I understand that you might say that, but for me it was restorative. I'm like, that's my Batman. The Batman I want to see is that Batman, not the bullshit Batman who's a joke. What were your key influences when creating a darker, older, more psychologically complex Batman? The notorious old TV show, the one with Adam West and Burt Ward, I mean, that was a goof. It was basically a snide take on stuff that I remember that I absolutely loved. I loved the comic book characters, and the TV show was constantly telling you how stupid the comic book was. Yeah, because it was counterculture against authority, and they sort of saw Batman as the man, and so I just felt like they were making the man out to be a sort of an idiot. Yeah, so without question, I was rejecting that damn show more than anything when I did The Dark Knight Returns. You were literally like, this is the opposite. This guy is the opposite of what you think he is. Yeah, this guy is no joke. One of the things you do in Dark Knight Returns with the voiceover and the sort of very specific language that he uses in combat and how he analyzes the combat that he's in, you go like, okay, this guy is 100% more complicated in his combat style even than you can imagine. I look at Batman as the self-made superhero. Bruce Wayne made himself Batman by studying, training, and exploring. Extraordinary feats come easy to Superman. He can fly and then the rest. I mean, just in terms of Superman, it's like you think you can do it. He can fly for God's sake, whereas Batman needs a goddamn car. I enjoy an effort. The one thing I really loved about the way you did Superman was also he's sort of a tool of the US government, but the Superman also in your version is self-aware. He knows what he's doing because everyone's like, oh, he's like a big Boy Scout. Well, it's like, no, he understands the political complexity of the whole thing. And he's just done the math and goes, look, this is the only way we are able to exist, is if we do it this way. Superman is an Appalachia warlord, and he's concerned with keeping the world from blowing itself up. Batman's this Dionysian character who's out for blood, and they're perfect opposites in that Batman is this reckless ego and Superman is the fearful superego. That's cool. I really love it because I love that Superman is in charge of keeping this. In a lot of ways, the children are tearing the preschool down. They're setting it on fire and they're out of their minds. And he's really just trying to wrangle us so we don't kill ourselves. And Batman's like, no, that's what it is to be alive, you know? That's cool. Batman is the happier character. 100%. Yeah, 100%. I wanted to abolish the pouty Batman. That's cool. Look, you know how I feel about the work. It's incredible. So the heroes in your stories are often morally ambiguous, or even sometimes anti-heroes. How do you view the evolution of the hero in modern storytelling? And why do you gravitate towards these more complex heroes? I regard defining the hero as being the center and purpose of my work, and in order to find something, you have to test it, prod it, attend it, and find new ways to portray it. And I find sometimes having a hero do wrong or take wrong courses is the best way to ultimately define what that hero is, especially with my Daredevil and my portrait of Superman. It's again the deconstruction thing, where you can get to a character's essence by having them wander far astray. With Daredevil Born Again, he essentially has a nervous breakdown. He loses control of his violence and his darker tendencies, and essentially has to lose everything before he can turn into a better character. Yeah, that's cool. For me, if someone says it in a hero's canon, he's not allowed to do blank, I immediately want him to do that, because I feel like if a character can't withstand breaking his own canon, then he's not really worth anything, you know? Right. And then what defines him? I mean, at first, Zack, I approached this kind of thing almost like a rebellious adolescent. I was told Batman could never fire a gun. I was told by the editor with absolute conviction. So I came up with an excuse for him to fire a rifle, even though it was just a grappling hook, into the side of a building. But it was just to get that picture from holding it. I don't like absolute dicta. Well, it's cool because if you can create a scenario where Batman has to shoot a gun and someone says, well, Batman can't shoot a gun, and you're like, well, what should he do in the scenario then? And then if someone says, well, don't put him in that scenario, I'm like, well, that's a weak character. You can't have a character where we're modifying the scenario because he can't exist in it. That's not realistic. Now we're just creating scenarios that his morality can work inside of, rather than the other way around. Absolutely right, Zack. That's not creative. And I think that's what Dark Knight did for me. It was like, oh, wait, Batman can actually live in my world, which I think was kind of cool. So that's just a little snippet. I think it's very interesting to see the way that Frank Miller views these characters. You know, when I read The Dark Knight Returns in high school as a kid, I didn't particularly like the way it depicted Superman. I kind of saw it as saying that your hero would sell out and work for the government, and that didn't really sit well with me. You know, of course, like Frank Miller was at one point, I was the rebellious adolescent. And to see that he was just kind of preying on the worst elements that are already present in both heroes. Batman is the aggressive ego, the violent, the carefree, and Superman is the super ego who is incredibly concerned and like hyper fixated, almost like a helicopter mom. That's a fascinating exploration, and it doesn't feel like he was adding something to a character that wasn't there before. He was just elevating elements of a character that had been there all along, but had kind of never been pushed to their utmost extreme. And like both Zack and Frank say, it's all about taking a character and seeing what people say, well, they can never do that, making them do that, and then showing how that makes them a better person at the end of the day, what they learn from it as a character through the crucible of change. And I just think it's fascinating. You know, for years I've heard people say that Zack didn't get The Dark Knight Returns because Batman did X, Y, or Z that he shouldn't have done, even though he does all of those things in comics. And you can see it right there. You know, The Dark Knight Returns was a middle finger to Adam West, which is funny because I've heard Adam West reading The Dark Knight Returns dialogue. I'll put a little snippet in here right now.
Do you know who I am, punk? I'm the worst nightmare you ever had. Kind that made you wake up screaming for your mother. You've got a mother, don't you? Every punk should have a mother.
And, you know, it's just like, what a phenomenal actor. Like, so transformative. That's such a different version of the character. I adore that. But I get that the perception around the character was kind of, well, no one takes him seriously, so let's not take him seriously. Or he represents this theological element of the system, the man, the guy in charge. So if we make the people in charge, the police are idiots, the fire department is stupid, the superhero who has like kind of this carte blanche police brutality like capability to him. He exists outside of the law. Well, what if we made him an idiot too? And then the stakes are never very high and we can just make fun of it. And that's kind of our way of projecting our discomfort with a societal issue onto a man in cotton spandex. And I understand that, it's not my style, but I get that. I understand using like a proxy to digest a complex issue that's maybe too sensitive to broach in certain circles. I understand it, but it's cool to see that Frank was like, that's not my Batman. I'm going to show you who my Batman is. Everything you say he can't do, I'm going to push it further and further and further, and I'm going to blur the lines, and I'm going to get away with making Batman do everything that editorial says I can't make him do. Because if he can't do those things and then still be Batman, then he's a bad depiction of the character. He should be able to go through the crucible and walk back out stronger than ever. But I thought it was fascinating. I never would have got that this was a middle finger to Adam West. Well, the character he portrayed. I think, obviously, Adam West was pretty much beloved by everyone. And I think it's just really cool to see that not only were Frank and Zack friends nearly 20 years ago, they're still very good friends. They're still very much involved in the comic book scene. And they both seem to be on the same wavelength. And so it's just fascinating. I've said for years that it doesn't make sense to hate one guy and love the other because they seem to kind of be doing the exact same thing. And I feel like this is vindication for me, which is a nice bonus. But I also just, seeing the way Frank was visualizing his characters and his impetus for the creative choices makes me love what he did more. It makes me appreciate it in a way that I didn't prior to this. And that's like my favorite thing about art in general, whether it be a painting, a sculpture, a movie, comic book, novel, whatever. Just like seeing it from your perspective and then seeing it with the knowledge of what was intended from the creator and what they were grappling with when they did it. It adds so much more to it, so much more texture. It is amazing. So, anyway, I think this is my union allotted break. I need to get back to playtesting these chapters. Right now, we're trying to decide whether or not to use Jean-Paul Valley or Henry Ducard as a character in this key moment, and ensuring that the stats on Batman and the Undersea Cursed King are both good. Like, chance to hit, damage output, damage input, things of those nature. Turns out my high school teacher was correct. I really would be using math as an adult. Those bastards. So, keep an eye on this space for the game's release coming around Halloween, along with the first book covering topics like what Frank and Zack are talking about here. And just have an awesome time. Go read the full article down below. It's really fascinating. It's fun to see that despite being such an old guy, Frank Miller is still kind of a rebellious teenager who anytime someone says, here's the line, he just steps 1 foot over it, and then they move the line, and he steps 1 foot over it again. And it's just like, man, I hope I'm that rebellious when I'm his age. That's amazing. I love that. So, have an awesome time. I had a blast reading this. I hope you have a blast reading it too. Stay safe out there.